Welcome to episode 60 of the How to Japanese podcast. I'm Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's January 2025. We made it. Otsukaresama deshita. I just sent out my monthly newsletter at Substack, so of course it's time for the podcast. This month I wrote about another set of impossible pairs, which is an idea I introduced last September. These are words that can only be differentiated with great difficulty and effort because of some kind of underlying similarity that makes them a challenge for second language learners. Excuse me. But first, I want to do my wrap for 2024. Back in March 2024, I kind of started to get frustrated with the pace of my creative projects. I wasn't having much trouble getting out my material each month. And for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I put up a monthly blog post and put out a monthly newsletter and podcast. I started writing the How to Japanese blog, howtojapanese.com, back in 2008. And I initially started with a 3-day-a-week schedule. This was back in the kind of heyday of blogs and the kind of more casual online writing. So the posts were a lot shorter, probably, 200 words max, I would say. Occasionally longer, but often shorter. So this made sense at the time, but I think 3 days a week right now for what I'm doing would be overkill and would probably dilute the product. At some point in the process of moving away from Japan and back to the US, working there, I kind of settled into once a month, which I've been managed to keep up along with everything else I've got going on. So it isn't much trouble for me to get the material out. Nothing changed last year. I was just kind of frustrated that there were months when it would come really close to the wire and I'd spend the last weekend knocking out some writing or recording the podcast or something like that. So last March, I doubled down and started tracking how much time I was spending writing and how much I was writing. So I still haven't gotten to 12 full months of doing this process yet, but I do think the data is pretty interesting and I wanted to share it because we have this nice, convenient, if artificial, marking point of a new year, the 2025, start of 2025. So I wrote for 148 hours last year, which is less than what my initial goal was. The goal when I started tracking was to write more than I played video games. I eventually did kind of cut back, but I will blame the kind of lingering playthroughs of Baldur's Gate that I was getting through and Shadow of the Erd Tree and Hades, which I finally got into, and a few other games for putting me over the 350-hour mark again on PlayStation. I think I had like 50 hours on Switch, and then I don't even want to think about hours on my phone playing Pokemon Pocket, but luckily it's not tracked for me, so I don't have to think about it too closely. But I did start a habit of not playing video games during the week. That seems to have stuck, which is good. So I do feel like at some point my rolling pace of writing will surpass the number of hours of video games I'm playing. In terms of the total volume, I wrote 69,226 words. That includes everything, newsletter, blog post, podcast script, any kind of writing I included. I also included, in terms of the time, I also included the time I spent editing the podcast, getting it set up, posting it, things like that. And looking at the month-to-month levels, I think this follows the kind of standard pattern of any kind of new activity that anyone does, that anyone gets going. I started off really strong and then hit my highest volume and most time in July, which would have been about 3 or 4 months in, about halfway through the amount of time I've tracked so far. I wrote 9,000 words in July and spent over 21 hours writing, which is nearly a full day of the month. That's pretty excellent. And my lowest was towards the end. I got a little sick in October, and then in December I went away on a trip and was busy with both work and kind of Oshogatsu celebrations. So it definitely dropped off towards the end of the year. I also haven't gotten a good start to this year after catching what I think might have been the flu literally on January 2nd, which put me out of commission until about the 7th or 8th. So I didn't really get started writing. But I'm determined to get kind of closer to that average pace of about, 7,000 words a month that I know I'm pretty capable of hitting, and that's less than 300 words a day if you think about it. It's really not all that much, but you do kind of have to force yourself to sit down and do it. And this may seem like a bit of a distraction at the beginning of the podcast, but is it really? Is this unrelated to Japanese study? I guess it's slightly related in that I write about Japanese study, but you could very easily use this for Japanese study. One thing that I did not do when I studied, or initially was starting to study, was to track any aspect of what I was doing. I was kind of naturally good at creating a pace for a study plan, for example, especially for something like the JLPT. I was really good at getting a study guide, figuring out how many grammar patterns or kanji, however many pages or exercises or lessons there were, dividing that up into a daily pace that I needed to hit in order to get through it by a certain time, and then just sticking to that. But I didn't keep that data anywhere, which I think would have been good, and I think probably would have influenced my studies in a beneficial way. But and I say this from having done this writing exercise. It really felt good to be writing. It felt good to hit a streak for the month and get out ahead of my schedule. I'm feeling the benefits of it even now. This month I kind of expanded on ideas that I started writing last spring, so nearly a full year ago. It also felt good not to be straining for a new post every month, and it felt good to be able to write a new post on a whim if I wanted to, and let other material sit. I've got other half-written posts kind of sitting, fermenting, that I can add on to when I need to. And then it also felt good to kind of put in time on longer-term projects that I'm working on with material that I don't think people will see for a long time, which I had made time for because I wasn't rushing to finish up my other stuff, because I had put in time already the previous months kind of getting that stuff ready. So I think that my goals aren't anything crazy this year. They're just kind of hit the same comfortable pace that I was hitting last year. I have a few things in March and February this year that I think will have my attention, including a family visit from the US. But I do feel like having this in place is going to kind of help keep me on track over the course of the year. And I would encourage you to do the same if you're with your Japanese studies or with your writing, whatever you're doing, translating. And I think there are ways that you could. So how could you track your Japanese study? Well, obviously the one that I think stands out is kanji. You could track the number of kanji you're getting through each day. As I mentioned, with something like the JLPT, you could track grammar patterns per day. Reading, I think, would be an excellent thing to track, because that, I think, especially lends itself to data. How many pages are you reading per day? What does that add up to over the course of the year or month, a year? How many books does that add up to? That's another thing that I was really good at tracking, I think, or not tracking, but sticking to when I was first getting into reading. I was really good at hitting a page count every day to make sure I got through whatever it was I was needed to get through by a certain date. And you can combine all of these with time spent studying, which is probably going to be the most difficult and frustrating to track, especially because you have to be pretty specific about it. And actually, that was the hardest for me. By the end, I was definitely kind of saying, this was 30 minutes, this was about 45 minutes, this was an hour, rather than at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the project, I should say, when I was being very specific about start times and stop times and things like that. And so that's one thing I'm going to try and get back on track myself. But if you could just measure out, how much time you're spending studying Japanese, even that alone, I think, would lead to some very tangible benefits once you start to add it up over months and years. And you don't need any kind of crazy materials or apps to do this. That's, I think, one kind of false assumption that people get into is when they start a new project, they want some kind of paraphernalia that helps them do that project. and I don't think it's necessary. I just keep track in a Google Sheet, which is nice because then I can turn it into a bar graph over time, and it's more or less free. And so I would recommend using Google Documents. I also write in the program Scrivener, which is not free, but it is not a subscription model. It is a one-time payment, and I really recommend it for anybody writing. I like it because it's super helpful because it logs the number of words you write each day for each file. So if I forget, I can kind of go back in and get that number. It's not lost into the ether. I do have to watch time. I wish Scrivener somehow tracked time or had some kind of built-in timer that you could like click on whenever you were writing. That would be a nice little feature. But see what you can do. There's power in numbers, and I think starting now, no matter where you are in your studies, is going to be better than starting later. Your future self, I think, will thank you if you can get your current self to start tracking some of what you're studying and what you're doing. And with that kind of brief aside at the beginning of the podcast, I'll now get into the newsletter content for the month. I took advantage of some of the work I did last year with the Impossible Pairs post I wrote in September. Initially, that post was going to be like 10 different impossible pairs, each with a short introduction. And then when I had written it out, it was ready to go. And when I went to actually post it in September, after having written it, several months prior, I realized it was just way too much stuff. And so I divided it off 2 of those for the very first one in September. And this month I expanded on that. Last September I wrote about tashka and tashkani, which I've already mastered. These are the 2 words that are used to mean definitely and perhaps, kind of an interesting combination there. And then I also introduced yokka and yoka, the 4th and the 8th of the month, which I think I'm still working on, but I do feel like my mnemonic that I created there has been super helpful, which was long vowel later date, long vowel later date. If you can kind of get that in your head, then yoka comes very easily as the 8th and yokka for the 4th. This month I wrote about jotai and jōkyō, words that I think you probably hear relatively frequently. They're these kind of 2 very similar words. They have overlapping sounds, and with the jo in the beginning of both. And they also have, I think, well, this really only affects like English, native English speakers who are studying these 2 words, but they have overlapping English translations to a certain extent. And it's really just a coincidence, kind of, I think, because the actual meaning of the words is so different. But I do feel like that overlapping potential translation causes problems for English speakers trying to learn these words, because they sound similar. They are similar in that they're words that are used to kind of discuss more abstract concepts, conceptual words, rather than specific physical words like computer, desk, tree. Think words like that are very specific things. So how do we tell the difference between these 2 words? One of my Japanese instructors used to say that jotai is used for smaller things, just kind of in the big picture is something that's small. So, for example, the condition of a used book. Jotai is the word you would use to describe that. The condition, the state of the book. Is it in good condition, bad condition, overall? Is it mint? Is it used? Is it worn? Is it well worn? These are all words describing the jotai, right? So that is something small, and it is specifically that the state that something is in, the condition. Condition is the one word I think that usually gets us in trouble here, condition, because jōkyō is used for larger situations, such as the situation, the state, or the conditions plural in the Middle East, right? That's 状況. And so this is relatively a good mnemonic, I would say, or way to remember these. 状態 small, 状況 big. But as I was looking into this word for the newsletter, I found a really funny post on Yahoo Chiebukuro that asked this question. 状況と状態の違いを小学生でもわかるように親切に教えてくれる? So I'll read that one more time. 状況と状態の違いを小学生でもわかるように親切に教えてくれる? Which translates to, could you kindly explain the difference between 状況 and 状態, like I'm a child, specifically an elementary school child? And Yahoo Chiebukuro, if you don't know, is, I can't remember what the English translation is, but it's Yahoo questions or something like that. But it's definitely more of a phenomenon, I think, in the Japanese version of the site. And there's lots of people that responded, and the person who asked the question can award a gold medal to the best response, which I'll read out. And so this person took the person literally and said, Jigoro-kun, ii, yoku kite ne. So you can tell already that he's talking to this person like they're an elementary school child. 今日の天気はどう? お空見てみて。曇ってる。これが状態。今の様子だね。まだ曇ってる。どう? さっきは曇っていたけど晴れてきたよ。これが状況。変わっていくことだよ。お払い痛いよは状態。ちょっと治ってきたは状況。わかったかな? So that's this kind of funny version of a response that somebody put together, taking the OP literally at their word and explaining it to them like they're an elementary school kid. And at first I thought, oh yeah, that's funny. This is a nice little kind of internet response. But the more I thought about it, I think the responder really does hone in on the difference between the words. And if you could hear what I introduced, 状態 he described as 今の様子. 今の様子. 様子 is this great word that means appearance, state, kind of conditions. And 今の様子. So the current conditions, right? It's 状態 is what something is right now at this current moment in time. And 状況 they described as 変わっていくこと, right? Specifically, they said it was cloudy and now it's become sunny. That's 状況, this changing situation. And seeing that, that's when it hit me. There's an aspect of time that differentiates these two words. 状態 is a static concept. It's the condition singular, right, of something, one thing, how it is, what it looks like, what state or condition it's in at a single point in time. So a used book, is it good? Is it worn? Is it bad? It's at a single point in time. It may change, it could change, but when you use 状態, when you're looking at something's 状態, it is looking at a specific moment in time. The one that I see all the time, obviously I've mentioned a couple times, is this used book condition thing, because I'm often browsing Mercari and they have 商品の状態 as one of the different categories that you need to fill out when you're posting something for sale. And you see lots of different responses. They have a couple built-in ones, but the one that I think is probably most typical for a lot of the books on the site is 目立った傷や汚れなし. 目立った傷や汚れなし, which is no noticeable flaws or stains. So what is 状況 then? If 状態 is a single point in time, a static single point in time, what is 状況? 状況 is an amalgamation of the 状態, of many different things in flux within a kind of given situation over time. So it might be the state of a project or an organization, which is made up of a lot of different moving parts. For example, all the people that are working there, as well as the kind of products they're working on, the systems they're working with. 状況 is all of these things in concert. And there's no assumption that it's this kind of single moment in time. It's actually the opposite. It's not a kind of long, extended period, maybe. I guess it's, depending on how you look at it, maybe it could be, but there's a kind of focus around specific moment and a little bit of zengo time before and after that moment. And so jokyo then is a kind of a wider space time around the current moment. It's dynamic, it's changing too. Whereas jotai is static, jokyo is dynamic. There's an understanding that things are in flux, things are moving. It's conditions plural, if that makes sense. So this really solidified the two definitions for me, and I hope it does for you as well. I included one other link on the newsletter to another page from an applied linguistics website. And the site gives two definitions for the words and then breaks down the different usages, which I think is another interesting way to look at them. It kind of gives the frequent usages for both of the words. And for jotai, it says, it can be the condition of somebody's body, mind, or so karada no yosu. It can be the condition of a product or a device, shohin or kiki no yosu. And this is kind of what I've already mentioned for jotai, right? These are specific static points in time, the condition of something or someone. It also notes that that jotai can be the object of a verb that preserves, fixes, or restores. And the examples that it gives are tamotsu, so protect, naosu, to fix, and I believe it's pronounced fukugen suru, so restore to original, literally. And so those are the kind of places where you can see it. So you can see, especially with the object of a verb, that jotai can change. It's not like fixed forever, but at any given time, it is a static thing that will either stay as it is or need to be fixed or will deteriorate, something like that. And then jokyo, the examples it gives here are, it's frequently used to say the state of society / an organization, shakai soushiki no yosu, or the state of something related to work, shigoto kankei no yosu. So again, we have that word yosu, right, which is, state, conditions. But I do feel like if you think about jotai as a condition singular and jokyo as conditions plural, that kind of gets at the complexity level and the dynamic versus static nature. The kind of things used with jokyo are, as my Japanese instructor said, much bigger, right? Society, an organization, a company, things like that, which you can also use jotai for, but it's in terms of, you wouldn't use jokyo for the static conditions of a book. You might talk about the conditions in which a book is published, something like that, the maybe shuppan jokyo or something like that, but you wouldn't use jokyo to describe the specific static condition of a book. And then it also gives us a couple examples of the verbs that are used frequently with jokyo. So here it says that it's often the object of verbs that report, explain, or investigate. That would be hokoku, setsume, and chosa. Those are used with jokyo. So I hope that helps you differentiate these two words. Are these words that you've struggled with? Are there any usages that you've noticed? How have you been able to differentiate between these two? Leave a comment if you've struggled with them. One other thing that I think that I added on the blog as a kind of little mini addendum is that jotai is much more of a game vocabulary word than jokyo. And I noticed this while I was kind of doing some initial research. And I think this is because games are essentially at their base level status reports. You're playing a character in relation to other characters in the game, whether they're enemies or allies, and you need to kind of know what their conditions are at any given time, which is why you see jotai more often in games. And one of the places where it popped up was Pokemon and the phrase mahi jotai, which is how you say something is paralyzed, right? Or yakedo, or doku jotai, right? Or what's the other ones? There's a couple others, but these are basically essentially the kind of statuses that your Pokemon can get into. They can get paralyzed, they can get burned, they can get poisoned, and in general, you translate this idea as tokushu jotai or jotai ijo, something like that, non-normal status, or tokushu jotai, special status, something like that. That's the kind of general way you would use to talk about it. You wouldn't use jokyo for that situation. You talk about maybe the jokyo of the society or the world in the game, but for jotai, right, the specific character, their state at any given moment, jotai would be the word that you're using there. And that's all I've got for you this month. A short little introduction to this Impossible Pairs. Look forward to more Japanese this month. I do feel like, given a couple obligations that I have at the end of February, beginning of March with a family visit, the next couple of months will probably be a little bit lighter than normal, but I'm going to be trying to put away material for later this year, and so look forward to that. I do have one Ito Ito link at the bottom of the newsletter I should mention, which is about a New York Times profile of Koji whiskey that's made using koji to access the sugars in the barley. This is a type of whiskey that Christopher Pellegrini and Stephen Lyman have been promoting, and they've also introduced a lot of the background for it on their podcast, Japan Distilled, so definitely go and give that a listen. I have a link to both of those in both the newsletter, at the bottom of the newsletter, so take a look there and give that a read. And hope you all are having an excellent start to the month and keeping warm. Pretty chilly out there, so stay warm, and we'll see you next month.